Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. This is our twice monthly meeting, December 15th, 2021. It was monthly, it went fortnightly, and now it's every first and third Wednesdays, so we can just say it's twice monthly. Yeah, thanks, Aubrey. I was just about to write that on the agenda.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure who was in there.
Yeah, so I started writing. Okay, so what we have on the agenda right now is, first of all, the repeating thing about asking about our blueprints and green papers, basically use cases and technical documents, living technical documents is the idea of that wording there. Still a work in progress because I don't.
Right. I offered to throw my hat in on helping out with that one, and I've done some research on the conversations and the concepts as well. And by the next meeting, I'll have something written up definitively. So that last meeting was my first one, so I'm still sort of catching up with that thread. So
awesome. So we can just say you will have
a deliverable by the next meeting. Yes.
Okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
I figured it out.
Oh. And okay. Yeah. And cool. Do we have any other? I mean, I think this ties into. Maybe we should reorganize these two things because I think the new stack article and then it does relate to this as well. So I'm going to bump that up above the adoption journey document thing, if that's okay with everyone. And also, if anyone else has items to put on this list, please do. Yeah, okay, anyway, so about the idea for these implementations and use cases and technical docs, there are two things that have come up recently. One is an extension of the landscape part of our charter. It's one of the work products from the GitOps working group charter that was envisioned initially. Again, just for folks who might not have heard this, you think immediately of the CNCF landscape. The idea is not to create, there's just not enough material there, first of all, to create some sort of extremely massive, sprawling, just landscape of icons and so on. But it's more like there are some tools out there, not only two of them, there are more as well, and probably more coming for GitOps. Part of the charter is to spell that out a bit, help folks with understanding what's available, what they do, and even part of the Open GitOps project is to the stated goal is to have any potential code that might help with interoperability between the various tools and specs if we have them and whatever else. So I'm mentioning the new stack article, or I'm bringing into this the new stack article that Aubrey mentioned that Christian wrote and got a lot of feedback on from a bunch of folks in the community. Basically, thanks Christian and Aubrey for spearheading that. That's super awesome. I'll try to keep my personal opinions out of it, except for I just want to quickly say I think it's great. I think it's a really good initiative. And there's a pull request already open that's currently has a lot of comments on it. Probably a little bit, sorry, I'm gonna keep this part of it short. I just wanna say probably a bit premature, because the first comment on that pull request is saying that, we're really going to refactor that based on this another HackMD doc that's out there. At least that's the idea. And it's something that it's open to, this is for the GitOps working group to work on. And the idea is to start with philosophical and technical differences between the Argo CD project and the Flux project, just because they're the two most popular tools that are out there currently, but also pave the way for comparisons between other tools and to just help guide folks into what they can use and when. So that is it for me as an intro. Oh, Christian, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, and I mean, as the person who started it, because there were some comments on the PR, and Chris, I see your message. I'll get you the PR right now, and talking about like what the genesis of it was, or someone asking like what's the goal here. Originally, it was because on the heels of GitOps the number two question asked was, what's the difference between Argo CD and Flux CD? So trying to take advantage of that, right, and some of that SEO that comes with that, and then again, we gathered all this feedback, and the new stack also said that the original article was really, really long, so which is why it was moved into a PR, and the new stack article then points to that PR, right? So the idea being, the call to action is for more people to join and give their thoughts and feedback. To Chris's point on that PR, I don't know if it asynchronously is the best way. I don't know even if it's now even a good idea to like even try to compare the two. We might, the energy might be towards like best practices with the tools. I don't know. I'm not married to that PR. I'm not, married to any idea. It's just, they're just kind of ideas now. So, so yeah, anyways, that was kind of like the background a little bit before anyone else puts their thoughts into there. So.
Cool.
I think you hit the nail on the head with suggesting maybe putting more emphasis on benefits of them in their own right. It seems like a lot of energy could be spent on sort of spent on something that ultimately won't be productive, because people are going to be deciding on the tools based on their own interpretation of the merits. And if this group really wants to be agnostic, one of the best things that it can do is to say, okay, here's the best that you could do with this tool that people are using, with these tools that people are using. These are best practices with these tools that align with the GitOps framework. My thoughts.
I want to stay away from the possibility of negative connotations. Does that make sense? Right? Because there's a reason something is negative to somebody. It's because of their context that they're coming at it from, right? So yeah, looking at benefits, looking at features, that's where we should focus, I feel like. And we could even throw other tools in the mix, right? Like Cruise is out there. There's some other stuff out there that we can use, like Tag App Delivery has several ways to deploy Potato Head. So we could evaluate all those and say, like, these are the best practices for all of them. And then more caveats for specific things if need be.
Scott, you're biting your tongue. What do you think?
No, I'm just, I do agree with those things, but I don't know that I think it can also be a yes and. That's mostly it. There's really just a practical benefit to folks understanding when they don't really know. They basically, people get sales when their use cases match up to various approaches. They just don't know. And so it's just, I would say it's very hard to pick through in the case of Argo CD and Flux, because the overlap is so great.
Well, I think all these tools are going to have a degree of overlap, right? Like anything in the landscape is going to overlap with something else in the landscape. I think that's fair to say. I mean, it'd be weird to have GitOps tool A not have any overlap with GitOps tool B, right?
Probably, yeah. I think like for what's productive for the ecosystem, how this is played out in other areas of the cloud native landscape is different tools end up filling different needs. Some fill similar needs, and they have some sort of healthy competition, I guess you could say. They might end up having some interoperability, or they might not. And the jury's still out on whether that will ever happen with Argo CD and Flux. And either way, it's okay. But I also imagine other tools in the ecosystem will fill yet other needs. At least that's my guess. I don't really know. We'll have to see like how popular GitOps continues to be. Right now, it's looking pretty good.
One thing that might factor into this discussion is, so assuming that these tools are going to change over time, is it easier to continuously update a comparison, or is it easier, or is the first step ultimately people writing documents for these individual tools and best practices for them and how they fit into the GitOps framework in terms of what this group can do over time, right? So maintaining a comparison might be harder, right? But in each of us individually writing something on the tool that we know pretty well, or multiple of us working on one document for that particular tool, seems more feasible in terms of a volunteer group like this.
Personally,
then one or multiple people having to sort of work on a comparison document and updating a comparison document. That's my thought.
Yeah, sorry, I was just laughing at Christian's comment. Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, sure. I mean, I would say we if there is anyone in the world who could maintain like something like this, that would be this group. Whether we, if it seems like we don't want to do that as a group, that's fine too. For me, I think it's just the energy, I think, started with Red Hat folks trying to answer that question from GitOpsCon, and then realizing, dang, there's kind of a lot here that could be that really shouldn't be limited by by what, say, the new stack or some other blog format should allow. There's more to it, and the end users deserve to know what they are looking for, whether it's this question or any of the other important questions. So yeah, I agree with you in terms of documentation. We can't maintain full documentation for any of these tools. It's up to the tools, but but it is part. A landscape is part of our charter. So yeah, I think who was asking about that? I wonder if we have an open GitOps landscape. We don't yet. That's the thing. This is part of the idea, is that we might not have done this first. We might first want just a more traditional landscape document that lists the tools and just high level of what they do and so on. And that was something we all discussed too, and that would be a separate pull request. This just was because it was timely, and it got started. And there's no mandate to even do this in Open GitOps, and there's also no time limit. So I don't really have much more to say about that, except
I feel like once you do something, though,
you have to maintain it.
To it.
Yeah,
right. That's the thing.
Exactly.
Once you put it out there, you have to.
Mm-hmm.
So what if, like, we had one of those things where it's like, how, I don't know, insert publication here, when they're comparing like headsets for Christmas or something, right? Like they have, oh, great base response or, you know, kind of tinny or whatever, right? Like it's entirely possible we could have like a list of things that are features of a project as just like a card. And yes, I've been looking around the internet lately. And it's just like has a GUI, has, you know, API you can call, you know, installs a CRD on every node, that kind of thing, right? Like having that as like this blanket kind of checklist for every GitOps application and yes or no, that alone could solve a lot of problems, right? We just have to determine what things to put on that list of yes or no's.
Well,
So like a table basically with check boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Like Argo has this, you know, Flux has this, Cruise has this, other tool has that, you know, yeah.
so I mean, I like that idea. I think from a positioning standpoint, this is what, like we have this idea of these green papers that are essentially opinion pieces. Now, we as a working group don't take a position on which tool we should get, which tool you should use. We're agnostic about that. And so getting into the comparison game in an official capacity feels very, very fraught.
Yes.
But if Red Hat wants to bring a green paper to the table of here's our view of how we compare these tools, then I would say, and yeah, my advice would be to Chris's point, yeah, do a table. And I would even just label it like comparing Flux and Argo in 2020, 2022. And then next year, maybe you do an updated one or maybe quarterly or whatever. But like green papers should very clearly be labeled. This is a member of the community's opinion. This is what they're bringing forward. And I don't know that I would, within green papers, there's a fair amount of latitude. So people can say, here's how you should really be doing security if you're doing GitOps. And it's like, oh, okay, that's not something we've really tackled as a group. And those things may become officially adopted documents after some time. And maybe they will become part of like a sort of, you know, thumbs up corpus. I don't know that we would necessarily avoid, like if someone wanted to be like, why I think Flux is better than Argo, and here's my green paper on that topic. It's like, I don't know if we would allow that, but it is green papers are meant to be somebody's point of view and not necessarily, but ideally they'd be something that could potentially be adopted. So I guess I think specific tool recommendations would not be something that you would include in there. Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no problem. I just don't know that that's true about, I don't want to proceed with that assumption that, I mean, first of all, green papers is not a very widely used concept, right? It was just kind of cute that we kind of came up with like, you know, the blueprints and green papers, right? Like that's pretty cool. It seems catchy and good. But like green papers, as far as I understand, similar to what we would do if they were just living documents or something working toward a white paper, which is pretty much what they are, is that they're not really meant to be opinion pieces at all. They're meant to be just works and proposals in progress or works in progress made by a group of people, by some official group of people, but it's not yet an officially adopted white paper, you know, whether it's a government or an industry or whatever, you know. So I think I put a link in real quick that I don't want to speak too much on this, but I just put a link real quick into, you know, like the little draft that several of us were sketching up. In no way is it official, but it represents, if you check out the intro, it represents really what folks here just said about ensuring like what the purpose of this is, that it is unbiased. The goal is to present all of these projects in the best light possible, and to make sure to remove any biases from this, just to focus on being factual. But I would say maybe take a look at that, see what you think, if that shapes your opinion. But you know, if the will of the group is that we really don't want to have any comparison documents whatsoever, you know, I'm not going to push it.
I think it's okay to have a comparison document as long as it's labeled very clearly from somebody's point of view and not from the working group necessarily.
Okay, Chris?
I just want to point out that some organizations within the GitOps working group or Open GitOps are very document driven, and they could potentially spam this process, right? Like I could totally see me sitting here at AWS and everything I write gets thrown up against the wall to Open GitOps, and it's just all this stuff from AWS. Or any vendor could do that particularly, right? Like it's entirely possible. Does that make them the authority on it? No, but boy, AWS is going to have a lot of content about it. I'll tell you that right now. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's not good. I don't know.
I think if it wasn't, I think there is a little bit of a complication with the fact that out of the, 9 people here, like I think I'm one of the only ones who doesn't work for a company that specifically deals with these technologies or specifically provides these technologies, right? So I'm from the university sector, right? But the rest of you all have skin in the game, so to speak, right? And outside folks might view things a little differently,
right,
as these come out.
So this is let me put my hand down. Hold on. This is the kind of like in the beginning what I said. Maybe the effort would go into like best practices versus. So like I can totally see, and like Dan, to your point, it's like, hey, I chose Flux because of X, and this is why it worked well for us. That's different than saying I chose Flux because Argo sucks, right? Like right. So like I assume hopefully we're gonna do the former, right, and not the latter, right? Or having say, hey, I chose Argo CD because it solved this use case for us, for whatever, right? And I think hopefully that's kind of where the kind of these green papers or kind of these best practices are, those are going to be the ones that we ultimately accept. So yeah, so let me mute. I'm done.
I mean, my 2 cents, I typed it in chat. I'd much rather spend the time working on best practices and allowing for like a blog process to churn out opinion pieces potentially. But yeah, the comparison piece, when Christian pulled me into it, I was like, oh, we're really going to do this. Right. So, because to me, I am tool agnostic, even though I've worked at Red Hat, I've worked at AWS. I don't care. Whatever tool that you want to do that makes your job happy, do it, use it, whatever. But there's some best practices around GitOps that you need to know about during that tool selection process.
And I think ultimately that does help with adoption. So if the ultimate goal here is to get adoption and increase adoption, promoting the ways in which all of the tools can be used to get those standards and to work within that framework is ultimately going to get more adoption.
You can hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, Chris.
I'm in a house in Michigan, so maybe it's good.
AWS
yeah,
outage?
I think that when we talk to customers,
there's no TCs up here.
Can you hear me? No.
You're
just cutting in and out a lot. Maybe try turning off your video.
Yeah, Chris, try cutting off your video. There you go.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That's better. Yeah.
Is that better? Okay. So I was basically agreeing with the folks that we shouldn't be comparing different products here. I think what customers are looking for is they're looking for use cases. And like, for instance, here at Microsoft, I talk to tons of customers. Some love Flux, some love Argo CD. They have different use cases. But that's what we should be putting in the Open GitOps is how to use one and what are the use cases for them, right? And there's really good use cases for all the different tools out there. So I think at the end of the day, if we focus on what the customers want, which is, geez, how do I do this? Then I think we're going to really be helping.
All right. Yeah. So how do we summarize this in the notes here? I'm hearing a few different things, but it sounds like there's a similar tone going across. I'm not really sure what to make of it exactly, but I've heard a few things. One, and I would just want to note this down in our notes real quick. One is that it feels to several people like there are other areas in the Open GitOps document that would be more valuable than tool comparison documents, right? That's one thing. I don't really hear any arguments about that. I don't have any arguments against that at all. I think that that's what we had planned all along, and it's important. Two, as I'm hearing kind of a little bit of a difference of opinion about whether or not any kind of document that helps users understand the differences between what GitOps tools do is even acceptable within the Open GitOps project. That seems to be something that there's not consensus on yet. So maybe we can punt that if we don't have, there's no deadline for this. There's no specific need. This is just something that had come up recently. It just, this initial blog post got published and points to this pull request. So it's something we should at least discuss, and I think we have. Are there any other things that people brought up that we should make sure to note?
I would specifically note the idea of a table that basically is a
feature table.
Feature table. That's a good way of calling it, a feature table. Because that's something that, as a small time project, that one or more people in this group could tackle pretty quickly, is what would be the columns? Like what are the things that align with GitOps that you would want a tool set to have?
Right, like the fact that the tool adheres to the principles is step one. Yes, right, like some, 1 and 4 and 2, right? Like you could totally go down that route, but then is it really GitOps? No. Okay. But yeah, we're going to have more tools in this space. There's going to be more room for feature tables and more features on those tables as tooling matures. Dan, you look sad with your snow.
Not sad.
Sad Dan.
I don't have a clean solution or anything.
Yeah, there's no clean solution. We just need to make a decision.
And I'm mostly just thinking like about how do we just make a really clean process for green papers? Like just having clear guidelines on that, because right now we're having a lot of discussion about like an individual article, but I want to get to the programmatic angle, right? So that we can just have lots of people submitting them. We can have clear requirements. And so it's good to have one that we're looking at because it helps inform like what some of the requirements should be. But yeah, once we have that process, then it's easy.
This is a good test run. So
yeah.
Yeah, defined process. Good point, Jamie.
Cool. I think we should. Does anybody object to bumping up the GitOpsCon EU 2020?
Yes.
Okay.
Do it.
All right. Cool. 1 sec. All right, Christian, go.
Yeah, hopefully this will perk Dan a little bit up, perk him up a little bit.
I'm gonna turn my video over here.
Yes.
Too quiet, apparently.
You're just over there like snow in the background.
Yeah, exactly. There
chilling.
You go. I need a screenshot of
poor
that.
Dan.
So we met with the CNCF, right? The program committee. And so a couple of cool things came out of that. We are getting a second room. So we will have a dual track. We haven't really decided what that's going to look like yet, but we do have the second room. We got the confirmation from CNCF. So that'll be cool. It'll grow that out a little bit. KubeCon registrations came out today. I haven't checked, but they said that GitOpsCon registration is also there, like as an add-on.
Yeah, I'll go check.
So
I probably should have done that earlier.
Yeah, so it should be there, which is big, right? So people can start adding them, GitOpsCon right at KubeCon register when they register for KubeCon. So I don't know if there's a specific link. I was going to tweet about it from the open GitOps Twitter handle, but I don't know if there's a specific link. So I need to look for that, and then maybe I'll tweet it out later today.
Oh, and question, by the way, we
yep.
should note that we I think only GitOpsCon is only one of 3 so far that yes. will be launching with registration. So it's not.
That's huge, folks.
Yeah, it's a really positive thing for not adoption, but
for
getting folks
for visibility. Yeah, for eyeballs, right? Yeah. So it's really good. And I think the only other thing, which is kind of a bummer, I don't know if it's official yet, but we were told that there's going to be no virtual component for the Day Zero event, which is kind of a bummer. We were trying. I don't know, Dan, you were in that meeting. I don't know if it was 100% confirmed. I think they're still talking about it, but they kind of are leaning towards no, that they won't be a virtual component. So
it's a huge expense, and most people complain about it because it never works out.
Yeah, my impression was that the door wasn't necessarily completely shut, but that it was likely that there would be a virtual way to do it. Now, I think that I didn't understand that they wouldn't record them. Mm-hmm. So if they record them and they post them later, I think that's okay. And encouraging more, come to the event. That's something the CNCF really wants to do. And
she did say that she actually gave an explicit note on that they're putting effort into ensuring that the recordings will be available the very next day.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, if the recording is available the next day, that's not bad.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's not a substitute for the other, you know what I mean? Like a hybrid event. But I think what they're saying is that they're leaning, based on all the feedback they got, they're leaning toward like very, very heavily, right, toward it being an in-person event and just putting out some more effort to make it friendly to those who are remote, but not have direct, immediate remote participation. Yeah. Right? Is that what you remember too from the meeting? Okay.
So it looks like KubeCon will have a virtual component. It's just a day 0, day 1, day co-hosted events. So that was my understanding. So we didn't get a date on when CFP's open. So I think that's just going to be something that'll come, sometime next year. So we'll, as soon as we know, we'll blast it out. So I think that's it. I don't think I missed anything in terms of KubeCon updates, GitOpsCon updates.
Are we supposed to drive CFPs, or are we using their system? How does that work?
We went through, I think what we did last time, right? So we went through the CNCF, so they're going to be driving that. We're just going to be voting on them.
Works for me.
I could give a couple more of the notes I took, if that's helpful.
Yeah,
sure.
All right, and then also just keep me honest here, but I could have misunderstood something, but basically there was the 2 rooms thing. We still need to meet our sponsorship goal. Is one caveat there. It's not a big one because we met it last year, but we do still need to, reach that, or we still need to meet our basic goal. But there's confidence there. Capacity. The big room, the main room has 350 person comfortable max capacity with the COVID protocol. They said if it loosens up, they could fit more people perhaps, but that's going to be the plan for now.
Nice.
Do we want to note the early bird pricing and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think that's on the.
Yeah, what they said was, I mean, I have it written down. What they said was,
Oh, you have it written down? Okay, cool. I was like frantically
yeah,
looking for
no
it.
worry.
Yeah, all right, no.
Don't worry. I just meant we should note it probably, right? If this is appropriate here. It sounds like it is. Oh, sorry. Is Robert? Are you leaving? Oh, you left. Bye. Okay. Yeah. The early bird pricing is $199. So we should really be directing folks to doing that. Like, come in early. You save money. Standard is $349, and on-site is $449.
Who buys their stuff on site? I really want to know.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah, and that they are also, in terms of the hybrid thing, like that. Yeah, I think what you heard or what you got is what I got too. I didn't say it correctly earlier, but yeah, primarily about the co-located events, that they're not for now not doing full hybrid again. I don't know about the rest of it, but they're looking to still engage people virtually live during the day. But they're really trying to balance the feedback from attendees that they would rather be there in person, and that, like you said, Chris, that the hybrid just wasn't, it was an experiment and it wasn't ideal. The only other thing I noted from our meeting, our CFP topics, that we're just going to keep them the same as last year. For now, not last year. Last KubeCon.
Yeah.
But
it only feels like a whole year. Yeah.
Right. But but one thing we didn't really do much of last year was talk about this of GitOps and have much in the way of a panel of maintainers and folks that have been involved in the project, the GitOps working project. So we decided that as program committee last year, we posted that we was an intro that was like 10 minutes. So we did discuss. Oops, am I choppy?
Just a little bit.
You were.
Do I need to repeat anything, or was it just like choppy, but you heard it?
You probably need to start like towards the middle.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah, just repeat it.
How about I'll paste these links?
Yeah, there you go.
Or this comment. I didn't realize I was choppy. Thanks for letting me know. I don't want to frustrate anyone.
Oh,
was I choppy all this entire meeting?
No, just while you were talking for that one stanza. It was really weird.
Okay. Okay, then I would just say, just repeating that one piece was the closest we got to giving folks a real of GitOps, where the state of GitOps is, what the GitOps working group, is working on, how you can get involved. The closest we got to that was the intro that we all as a group discussed, and Dan and I presented for like 10 minutes. So the idea that we discussed in this meeting too is that everybody seemed to think that we could do a little bit more than that maybe this year or something like that. So just putting that seed out there for however that happens. That's it for me.
We will have a slide. So that's something that that's a hill I will die on it. So we could talk about it during the CFP selection process, but yeah, I do agree that at least that opening keynote thing should be, the state of open GitOps and how to get involved, all that fun stuff.
Yeah. Who all? I'm planning to be there. Is anybody not going to be able to make it?
I'm planning to be there.
Okay. So we'll have Scott and Chris and Christian and
Yep, I'll be there.
hopefully some others. Okay.
Okay, cool.
I was going to submit to KubeCon a GitOps panel again. I don't think anybody's done that. Have they?
I have not.
If we do, I would like to be on it this time.
Okay.
Like actually on it. Not have to bail due to timing issues.
Yeah, so I assume I would do kind of the same group as last time, but then I'm thinking, I wonder if Cornelia would actually want to be in again.
She's
and
doing
then
like Alexa stuff. She's not doing.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm also wondering how we can get some female representation.
What's Tamao up to?
Have who?
Oh yeah, Tamo from Weaveworks would be a really good person to be there.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think I've met her. Maybe
Yeah, she's yeah. I don't know if you had either, but
I'm trying to think. Have we been in a meeting with? No,
Like,
we haven't. No.
Have you ever seen Dan and Tamo in the same room at the same time?
Right.
Wait
No,
a
I don't.
second.
Oh, wait a minute. I would have gotten away with it too. All right.
I know. No. Yeah. Okay.
that's
I guess-
amazing. Yeah, let's. Yeah.
So yeah, send me. What do I need to do? I just need to make. I need to make a doc. I need to make a doc and share it with you guys. And I think would like to get a representative from the 5 mains at least in there.
Yeah, because if you want to do that as, or if I was somewhat curious about this as well, but I didn't propose one. But that's a really good note, Dan. The CFPs are due Friday, so we just need to get that sorted.
Oh, there you go. Start typing. Where's that?
I know.
Where's
I'm
that
happy to.
Kermit emoji.
Yeah, I'm happy to help work on the abstract for that.
Okay.
So we can. Whoever else wants to, yeah.
Share it now. Yeah, it'd be good to get somebody from GitHub as well to join.
What's the max that we have for a panel?
Like, don't do more than 4 or 5 people.
Well, I mean, I mean, there's probably a what you should do, but I mean, I wonder what is the max? Can you have like 10 people up there? I mean, that's ridiculous, but does the and we wouldn't do that, but does the CNCF have like, is there a max? Is it 5?
So I was gonna do 6,
Mm-hmm.
one for each of the founders, and then maybe I'll play double duty again as a moderator or something.
Cool.
Okay. So I want to get that in right away. So from your respective companies, if you could put in, who's our rep at GitHub again? I can't remember.
Oh yeah, I do know. Give me a second. Oh my God, if you're
Chris,
watching.
Microsoft sort of gets double placement because you have GitHub and Microsoft.
I thought Chris was from GitHub.
No, Chris is from Microsoft.
Right. So
I think it's Azure. It's Azure and GitHub.
Chris Patterson is who is the rep from GitHub. I know Microsoft owns GitHub, but yeah.
Okay, so I'll reach out to Chris and see if we can figure out. I don't know if he's going to be there or not, but.
By the way, we experienced, I don't know if you all have, but we experienced some off and on poor issues with Zoom earlier today on our international meetings. So it kind of didn't matter where folks were from. It wasn't really isolated to one spot. So we might be getting hit by that again. I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so in terms of our meeting, we have one more topic on the agenda. If there wasn't any more to cover for, I know we can talk a lot about GitOpsCon. I guess, do we have anything else we wanted to say about KubeCon, GitOpsCon? Okay, taking that as a no for now. And all right, so I just set it on the agenda, so that's why it's under my name via it's Lloyd via Ska is really what I meant.
I knew what you meant.
An adoption document. See that in here. Here's the direct link to the issue, and people have been adding comments and working on some primarily through comments since what is it, August. And then Lloyd opened a PR with the contents of that issue because Lloyd can't be on these meetings directly. So the only way that he can communicate is through comments. Some of them can be kind of long at times. In any case, this just happens to be one of those pull requests where it really isn't about him personally. He just did the work. He put together what people wrote and gave everyone co-authorship credit. So if anyone has immediate thoughts about this, now's the time to speak up. Basically, here's the
Oh, that's a lot to read. Okay.
Yeah.
Like the actual adoption journey isn't a lot to read though.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, like numbering them, I think is a bad idea.
Right. That was my thought too, because they don't seem progressive. Exactly, except
they're not progressive
small.
at all, right? So like,
yeah,
you probably need executive sponsorship way before you start a enablement strategy, right? Like, if your people don't want you spending time on this,
yeah, it should be bullets, right?
Like, this is like, how do you adopt DevOps in your organization, right? It's the exact same discussion. I don't know. Can we formalize that?
You know what it sounds like to me? A great green paper.
A great what?
Green paper.
Green paper.
Yeah, like, there's no one way to do this. Please tell me if I'm wrong.
You are definitely correct. I think that's something that we've had consensus on all this time, right? I would also like to see a little bit more than just a list of phrases like this, something like,
like
a little intro saying,
here's a header, start exactly small, that, here's
right?
Why. Something, right. Give it like, again, thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah. So I just wrote it in chat. I think I'm +1ing Dan. This should, I think, let's make a great green paper, right? Or at least, thought piece, blog. Yeah, you're right, Chris. Yeah. This is like, how do you adopt DevOps? It's like, right. it's
such like, an open question.
Well, and like, this document could be
need best practices that we can point to before we can even say this is how you adopt, right? Like,
well, it's funny because it's like this adoption journey is step 1, adopt DevOps, right? Like, and then that's it, because it's like essentially, anyways. We can go on this, but I just kind of just plus one.
I'm 100% with Jamie on this one, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I just wrote that in your note, Jamie, in our basically I'm just like writing some feedback. Also note that this is a PR, so people are free to add feedback through the PR process, but I'm just writing what folks said, like a quick summary in our meeting notes. Okay, I think we've covered that one, unless someone, I kind of, when you're microwaving popcorn and there's 2 seconds between popcorn kernels, I got that sense just now. Maybe it's time to move past this one, unless there's another burning desire. Okay, great. I just wanted to double check about like the next meeting. Oh, sorry. Two quick things: action items and then assignments for the next meeting. Do we have any? Someone help keep me honest here and scrape the action items from all the stuff we talked about today. Number 1 was a punt. Number 2 is an update. I guess
I'm starting to write those down.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's an inaction item, right?
What am I doing wrong here? Why don't I have edit access on this doc? What group am I not a part of?
Can you send me? It's Google Docs, so we had to just. Oh. Can you send me? Oh wait, are you just using your current email address?
Yeah, chris@chrisshort.net. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's probably why, because I think we probably had your Red Hat email in there.
There you go.
I'll do it.
And I assume you use Gmail for the chrisshort.net. But we'll see.
Oh wait, no, chris@chrisshort.net is you should have editor access. Are you signed?
I'm
signed in. Supposedly.
Unless you're on your AWS account.
I'm not on my AWS account. I'm logged in as, let me refresh or something. I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, just check it. I don't know.
No, I didn't want to align that to the right. Dumbass.
Or maybe the like where you can select between editing, suggesting, and viewing. If you're on suggesting, it'll always
now it's okay. I hit refresh and it's good.
Oh, you got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, it was in there, and I also noticed that Chris Sanders didn't seem to have edited access. Anyway,
maybe
we'll see.
Google's being weird today too. Who knows?
I guess we can't blame the USD. No, I'm just kidding.
It could have been US West 2 today.
Okay, so we don't have any. So the only other real action items that we have are encourage folks to work on these. Oh, I know. We have Jamie's action item, right? That's an action item. Yeah.
Well, the feature table thing is an action item too, I feel like.
What was?
The feature table. Like, what are those features?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, cool, great. It's a good section in our meeting notes, because we talk about all kinds of things and then we kind of forget what we just talked about because we all have a billion things going on. It's the holidays and everything else, Cool. And then assignments for the next meeting. First of all, when is the next meeting?
I believe
January, isn't it?
January 5th is what I have on my calendar.
That would be the 5th, yeah.
Because it's the first and third Wednesday.
First and third Wednesday, Chris. Wednesday.
What? Yes.
I don't know what freaking year it is half the time. I mean.
All right. So, anybody want to volunteer to be moderator of that next meeting?
What day was it again?
The 5th.
I'll do it.
Okay, Dan. Anybody want to volunteer to be notes taker for the next meeting? I noticed today some people took some notes, but mainly we didn't really ask anyone. So it was me kind of moderating and note taking. Okay, Christian, yes, thank you. Yeah, the idea is that we'll rotate this, just like totally informally, but anyone can do this. It doesn't necessarily, you don't even have to be in some kind of an official position to moderate or to help as note taker. It's an open group for open participation, and that's my little spiel. Anybody else have anything burning before we say farewell to 2021?
If it's not in Git, it's only a rumor.
Exactly.
Oh, actually, Christian, do you
Yes.
have a second?
Yes.
I will
yeah.
show you something. Anybody
All right,
else?
here we go.
I'm staying for this.
Yeah, same for the big reveal. Well, now you have everyone's attention. Oh no, the tense. It's very tense now.
Oh, in case you don't see the comment, Jamie, while we're waiting on this big reveal, if you can just DM one of us your the email address you'd use to sign into the doc, we'll add you as an editor.
So CodeFresh gave to all of our employees this nice new hoodie.
All right, sweet.
Boom. And on the back.
That's awesome. I need one of those. Now I have to have that.
You have to get one. Yeah, we have to give you one.
Oh man, that's awesome.
And I told everybody I'm very vocal. I'm always like, that was Christian
so
Hernandez.
great. That's so great. I love it.
And I always tell him he gave us permission. We can use it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I love it.
So well done.
Oh, I need that.
I'll
That
have to
is
get you one.
fantastic.
Yeah. All right, sweet. That's awesome. I have to have one now.
Yay.
Amazing.
That's cool. All right. What a way to end 2021. Awesome.
That was awesome, Dan. Good
That
job.
was awesome. That was a great review.
Have a good one. Take care.
All right, everyone.
See ya.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.